When Staff Sergeant Harold "Dutch" Morrison mixed gasoline with alcohol and diesel in a Detroit tank depot at 2:47 a.m. on November 8, 1944, his commanding officer called it sabotage. 9 days later, 18 German Panzer tanks sat abandoned across the Belgian countryside, their engines seized beyond repair. The enemy never discovered what killed them, but Dutch knew exactly what he'd done. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the maintenance bay at the Red Ball Express depot outside Antwerp, Belgium. It was 11:32 p.m. on November 7, 1944, and Staff Sergeant Harold Morrison could smell the peculiar mix of diesel fumes, burnt coffee, and winter dampness that had become the scent of war. The temperature hovered just above freezing. Outside, mechanics worked under floodlights, their breath visible in clouds as they serviced the endless convoy of trucks that kept Patton's Third Army moving. Dutch Morrison, nobody called him Harold anymore, stood at a workbench covered in fuel samples, his hands black with grease despite 3 washings. At 32 years old, he'd spent 14 years as a mechanic in Detroit before Uncle Sam came calling. He'd worked on Fords, Chevrolets, and Chryslers in shops where men spoke a dozen languages, but all understood the language of engines. Now he worked on Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and jeeps, while artillery rumbled in the distance like approaching thunderstorms. The problem keeping him awake wasn't complicated to understand. It was impossible to solve. German Panzer tanks were destroying American armor at a rate that made commanders physically ill. The statistics were brutal and specific. In the past 42 days, 127 Sherman tanks had been knocked out in the Hurtgen Forest sector alone. The Panzer IV and Panther tanks outgunned American armor with 75mm and 88mm cannons that could penetrate Sherman armor at ranges where American 75mm guns were ineffective. The Americans called their tanks Ronsons. They lit up on first strike. British tankers called them Tommy Cookers. The Germans called them Gifts. But Dutch had noticed something in captured German field reports that intelligence officers dismissed as propaganda or translation errors. 3 separate after-action reports mentioned Panzer tanks experiencing catastrophic engine failures during engagements, not from American fire, but from mechanical breakdowns that happened simultaneously across multiple vehicles. One German commander had written, 4 tanks of our company suffered complete engine seizure within 20 minutes of each other during combat operations. No external damage observed. Maintenance crews unable to diagnose cause. Dutch had brought this to Captain James Ridgefield, a West Point graduate who ran the depot with regulation precision. Ridgefield had looked at him with the patient expression officers reserved for well-meaning enlisted men who didn't understand the bigger picture. "Morrison, German tanks break down because we bomb their supply lines, and their mechanics are working with scrap metal and ersatz parts. That's all there is to it. Sir, with respect, these reports specifically mention fuel system failures in tanks that had been recently serviced, and German maintenance crews are overworked and undertrained. I appreciate your initiative, but we have 240 vehicles to service tonight. Dismissed." That conversation had happened 6 hours ago. Dutch hadn't been able to let it go. The science behind it kept gnawing at him. During his years in Detroit, he'd seen what happened when customers accidentally mixed fuel types, gasoline engines that got diesel, diesel engines that got contaminated gasoline. The damage was immediate and catastrophic. Pistons seized, fuel pumps failed. Entire engines could be destroyed in minutes. Insurance companies had entire departments dedicated to fuel contamination claims. What if it wasn't accidental? German logistics ran on diesel. Their tanks, trucks, and generators all burned the same fuel, which simplified their supply chain. American forces ran on gasoline for most vehicles, diesel for some trucks and generators. The Germans considered this inefficient, a weakness in American operational planning. But what if that separation was actually a strength? Dutch spread out a map of recent engagements on his workbench. He'd marked every location where German tank breakdowns had been reported, cross-referenced with intelligence reports about German fuel depot locations. There was a pattern, faint but present. The breakdowns clustered around areas where American forces had briefly held territory before German counterattacks pushed them back. What if American fuel had gotten into German supply lines? He pulled out a battered notebook where he'd been working through the chemistry. Pure diesel in a gasoline engine wouldn't ignite properly. The compression ratio was wrong. Pure gasoline in a diesel engine would ignite too quickly before proper compression, destroying the engine through pre-detonation. But what about a mixture? Something that would burn well enough initially to pass inspection, but would gradually destroy an engine through detonation timing issues, fuel system corrosion, and lubrication breakdown. The challenge was time. German mechanics would test fuel before using it. Any mixture that failed immediately would be caught, but something that passed initial testing then created progressive damage over hours of operation. That would be invisible until the damage was catastrophic. Dutch had access to something most mechanics didn't: captured German fuel samples. American intelligence collected everything from enemy positions, including fuel cans. He'd requisitioned 4 different samples over the past month, ostensibly to analyze German fuel quality for intelligence reports. He had those samples here, along with pure gasoline, diesel, alcohol, and even acetone from the paint shop. At 2:15 a.m., he began mixing. The first combination was simple: 60% diesel, 40% gasoline. He poured it into a glass container and watched it settle. The mixture looked stable, didn't separate obviously. He tested it with a match. It ignited, but sluggishly. A German mechanic would catch that immediately. He tried again. 70% diesel, 20% gasoline, 10% ethanol alcohol. The alcohol acted as a solvent, helping the fuels mix more uniformly. This one ignited more readily. He made notes in his notebook, recording exact proportions, ambient temperature, burn characteristics. By 3:30 a.m., he'd tested 17 different combinations. His eyes burned from fuel fumes and lack of sleep. His hands shook slightly from the cold and too much coffee. But he was close. He could feel it. The 18th mixture was 65% diesel, 25% gasoline, 8% ethanol, and 2% acetone. When he tested it, it ignited with a clean flame that looked almost identical to pure diesel. He tested its viscosity, close enough to pass visual inspection. He tested its smell, diesel dominant, with the gasoline mostly masked by the diesel's heavier odor. Then came the critical test. He had a small single-cylinder diesel engine on the workbench, a generator engine he'd pulled from a wrecked German Kübelwagen. He filled its small fuel tank with his mixture and pulled the starter cord. The engine fired immediately, running smoothly. Dutch let it run for 5 minutes, monitoring temperature, exhaust color, and sound. Everything seemed normal. He made notes, recording every detail. Then he shut it down and waited 30 minutes for it to cool. He pulled the spark plug and examined it under a magnifying glass. What he saw made his pulse quicken. Carbon deposits. Excessive carbon deposits that shouldn't appear after just 5 minutes of operation. The fuel was burning incompletely, creating buildup. Over hours of operation, that buildup would accumulate, combined with the corrosive effects of mixed fuels on seals and gaskets. The engine would run fine initially, then gradually lose power, overheat, and ultimately seize as the damage compounded. It was 4:47 a.m. when Dutch Morrison finished his final test. He sat on a stool in the maintenance bay, surrounded by fuel samples and chemical equipment, and faced a decision that made his hands shake for reasons that had nothing to do with cold or caffeine. What he'd created was sabotage material. Introducing it into German fuel supplies would violate every conventional rule of warfare. It wasn't a weapon you aimed at enemy soldiers. It was an attack on their logistics, their machines, their ability to maintain operational equipment. Captain Ridgefield would call it reckless, Command would call it irregular. The Judge Advocate General might call it a war crime. But 127 American tankers had died in the past 6 weeks because German armor was superior. Every day that disparity continued, more men died. Men from places like Omaha, Little Rock, and San Antonio. Men who wrote letters home to mothers in Brooklyn and wives in Oklahoma City. Men who believed in American ingenuity, American determination, American refusal to accept the impossible. Dutch thought about his younger brother Tommy, a tank driver in the 4th Armored Division. Tommy was 23 years old, engaged to a girl named Sarah from their hometown of Dearborn, Michigan. Tommy's last letter had arrived 3 days ago. The Panzers scare the hell out of us, Dutch. We're outgunned and we know it. But we keep going because that's what Americans do. At 5:12 a.m., Dutch Morrison made his decision. He filled 4 jerry cans with his special mixture, 60 gallons total. He labeled them with captured German markings he'd carefully copied from authentic containers. He loaded them into a jeep, along with a basic toolkit and his notebook containing every formula, every test result, every calculation. He didn't sleep. He didn't file reports or request permission. He simply waited for morning formation, then requested a 3-day pass to visit a forward observation post where his brother's unit was stationed. Captain Ridgefield, perhaps feeling guilty about dismissing him earlier, approved it without question. By 9:30 a.m. on November 8, 1944, Staff Sergeant Harold Morrison was driving toward the front lines with 60 gallons of the most dangerous fuel mixture ever created sitting in the back of his Jeep, and a plan that would either save American lives or get him court-martialed. The war was about to change, and nobody except one Detroit mechanic knew it was happening. The road to the front line was a study in controlled chaos. Dutch navigated his Jeep through convoys of supply trucks heading east, ambulances heading west, and columns of infantry marching with the exhausted determination of men who'd seen too much. The sky was overcast, threatening rain that would turn the roads into rivers of mud. The temperature was dropping. Meteorologists were predicting the coldest winter in 50 years, though nobody at the front needed meteorologists to tell them that. He reached the forward supply depot at 2:15 p.m., a collection of tents and sandbag fortifications outside the Belgian town of Malmedy. The depot commander, Lieutenant Marcus Chen from San Francisco, was a logistics officer who'd been an accountant in civilian life. He ran his operation with precise efficiency, tracking every gallon of fuel, every case of ammunition, every can of rations. Dutch found him in a tent that served as both office and shelter, studying supply manifests by lantern light. "Lieutenant Chen, Staff Sergeant Morrison from the Antwerp depot. Captain Ridgefield sent me to observe forward supply operations." It was a lie. Ridgefield had done no such thing, but Chen was too busy to verify it. "Morrison, good timing. We're establishing a forward fuel point 3 miles east. German counterattack pushed us back 2 days ago, but we retook the ground yesterday. There's an abandoned German supply depot there. We're checking it for booby traps and usable material. You're welcome to tag along." Dutch's pulse quickened. An abandoned German depot meant German fuel stores. "I'd appreciate that, sir." They left at 3:30 p.m. in a convoy of 3 trucks and 2 jeeps. The landscape was devastated. Shattered trees, abandoned equipment, and shell craters filled with cold water. The depot was a collection of concrete bunkers built into a hillside, camouflaged with netting that was now shredded by artillery. Engineers had already cleared it for explosives. Inside the main bunker, Dutch found what he'd hoped for: German fuel drums stacked floor to ceiling, 55-gallon drums marked with Wehrmacht eagles and diesel Kraftstoff stencils. The Germans had abandoned at least 500 gallons when they retreated. Lieutenant Chen was practical. "We can use this for our generators and diesel trucks. Get it tested and transferred to our drums." "I can handle the testing, sir," Dutch volunteered immediately. Over the next 2 hours, while engineers and supply crews catalogued German equipment, Dutch worked alone in the bunker with the fuel drums. He had 4 jerry cans of contaminated fuel. He had 500 gallons of German diesel. The mathematics were simple. 4 jerry cans represented roughly 15 gallons each, 60 gallons total. If he distributed that 60 gallons across multiple German fuel drums, mixing it thoroughly, he could contaminate approximately 180 gallons of fuel with a mixture that would pass casual inspection. But he faced immediate practical problems. First, he couldn't contaminate the fuel Americans would use that would sabotage his own side. Second, he needed this contaminated fuel to get back into German hands, which meant leaving it here for German forces to recapture, or creating a situation where Germans would seize it. The solution came from Lieutenant Chen himself. "Morrison, we're not staying here. Command wants us to establish the fuel point, then pull back to our main lines. This position's too exposed. Jerry could counterattack any time. We're taking what we can carry, destroying what we can't. Intelligence wants us to leave some supplies intact. They think the Germans are desperate enough that they'll risk patrols to grab supplies from no man's land." Dutch saw his opportunity immediately. "Sir, what if we leave the German fuel drums? They're compatible with German equipment, but not easily transferable to our specs. We'd have to spend time pumping them into our containers. If Germans recapture this position, they'll use their own drums immediately." Chen considered this. "Makes sense. We'll take American fuel forward, leave German drums here. Mark them for destruction, but don't actually destroy them. Intelligence wants to see if Germans will take the bait." It was perfect. Too perfect. Dutch felt the peculiar mixture of exhilaration and terror that came from watching an impossible plan actually work. After Chen left to coordinate with engineers, Dutch worked quickly in the dimming light. He selected 12 German fuel drums, strategically positioned where Germans would find them first. He carefully opened each drum, added 5 gallons of his contaminated mixture, then rolled each drum to mix the contents thoroughly. The contamination ratio was low enough that casual testing wouldn't reveal it. Approximately 8% contaminated fuel per drum spread across 12 drums. He marked these drums with a small chalk symbol on their sides, a mark that would be invisible to everyone except him, a mark that would let him know if his plan worked. But contaminating fuel wasn't enough. He needed German tanks to use this fuel under combat conditions, when they'd be pushing their engines hardest, and damage would accumulate fastest. The opportunity came sooner than expected. At 6:45 p.m., as the supply convoy prepared to leave, artillery fire erupted from the east. German 88mm guns firing from concealed positions. The shelling was harassing fire, not a full assault, designed to make American forces nervous, to probe defensive positions. Lieutenant Chen made his decision quickly. "We're pulling back now. Grab essential equipment only." The convoy evacuated within 20 minutes, leaving the German fuel depot intact exactly as planned. As Dutch drove his jeep west in the convoy, he watched the bunkers disappear into the twilight. 12 contaminated fuel drums sat waiting in the darkness, marked with Wehrmacht eagles, indistinguishable from legitimate German supplies. The next 48 hours were agony. Dutch returned to the Antwerp depot and resumed normal duties. Servicing trucks and maintaining equipment, he filed a standard report about his forward observation visit. Captain Ridgefield read it without comment. Everything appeared routine. But at night, Dutch couldn't sleep. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He'd created a weapon without authorization, deployed it without orders, and initiated an operation that violated every chain of command principle the military held sacred. If it failed, if American forces were harmed, if the contamination was traced back to him, he'd face court-martial. If it succeeded but was discovered, he might still face prosecution for unauthorized action. On November 11th, 3 days after he'd contaminated the fuel, the first report arrived. It came through intelligence channels, a decoded German radio transmission intercepted by Signal Corps operators. Dutch only saw it because he'd befriended a corporal in the intelligence section, a kid from Milwaukee named Eddie Kowalski, who owed Dutch a favor for fixing his Jeep. "You asked me to watch for reports about German mechanical failures," Eddie said quietly, handing Dutch a translated transcript in the depot's mess hall. "This came through this morning. Thought you'd want to see it." The transcript was marked Intercept Dare 3347, Tactical Frequency, German 116th Panzer Division. Requesting immediate mechanical support. 3 tanks inoperable due to engine failure. Symptoms include power loss, excessive smoke, and complete seizure. Maintenance crews report fuel system contamination of unknown origin. Request emergency fuel resupply and engine replacement parts. Dutch's hands trembled as he read it. The transmission was dated November 10th, just 2 days after he'd contaminated the fuel. The timing was right. The symptoms matched his predictions exactly. "Does this help?" Eddie asked. "Yeah," Dutch managed. "Yeah, it helps." Over the next 6 days, more reports arrived. German radio traffic increased with frustrated communications about mechanical problems affecting multiple armor units. Allied reconnaissance pilots reported abandoned Panzer tanks along roads in the German-held sector. Interrogated German prisoners mentioned fuel problems plaguing their armored divisions. On November 16th, intelligence compiled a summary report that Dutch read with mounting disbelief. 18 German Panzer tanks, 7 Panzer IVs, and 11 Panthers had been abandoned due to catastrophic engine failures across a 40-mile front. German maintenance crews couldn't diagnose the cause. Their fuel tested as normal in standard field tests. But engines that used that fuel experienced progressive damage that made them inoperable within 6 to 8 hours of combat use. The Germans suspected sabotage, but couldn't identify the method. Some commanders blamed faulty fuel from bombed refineries. Others suspected partisan activity. None suspected that fuel contamination had been introduced into their own captured supply depot, using their own fuel drums. American intelligence was equally confused. The analysts recognized that something unusual was happening, but couldn't explain it. The report concluded, "Enemy appears to be experiencing significant mechanical reliability issues of undetermined origin. Recommend continued monitoring." Dutch Morrison sat alone in the maintenance bay that night, holding the intelligence summary, and confronted the reality of what he'd accomplished. 18 Panzer tanks destroyed without firing a shot. 18 tanks that would have killed American soldiers, that would have destroyed Sherman tanks, that would have sent young men home in flag-draped coffins. But he'd done it alone, without authorization, using methods that no military manual described. He'd improvised a weapon from chemistry knowledge and Detroit experience. He'd deployed it through deception and opportunity. He'd violated protocols and chains of command. He'd acted like an American, practical, innovative, willing to break rules to get results, and it had worked beyond his most optimistic projections. The contaminated fuel was spreading through German logistics as they redistributed captured supplies. The damage was accumulating invisibly, destroying engines faster than German maintenance crews could replace them. Dutch pulled out his notebook and began calculating. If 12 drums had produced this result, what could 60 drums accomplish? What about contaminating German fuel trains, supply trucks, forward dumps? The war had changed 3 days ago when one Detroit mechanic mixed fuels in a cold maintenance bay. But nobody except Dutch Morrison knew it yet, and he was just getting started. By November 20th, 1944, German commanders across the Western Front faced a crisis they couldn't explain, couldn't diagnose, and couldn't stop. The situation reports arriving at Wehrmacht headquarters told a story that violated every assumption about mechanical warfare. At German 116th Panzer Division headquarters, in a commandeered farmhouse outside Düren, Oberstleutnant Friedrich Weber stared at maintenance logs with the expression of a man watching his world collapse. Weber was 41 years old, a career officer who'd fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He understood tank warfare with the instinctive clarity that came from experience. He understood logistics, maintenance, and operational planning. What he didn't understand was how 23 of his division's tanks had become inoperable within a 2-week period without enemy action. His chief maintenance officer, Hauptmann Klaus Richter, stood across the desk with reports that made no sense. "Herr Oberstleutnant, we've inspected every disabled tank. The damage pattern is consistent. Fuel system failure leading to engine seizure, carbon buildup in cylinders, corroded fuel lines, destroyed fuel pumps. The engines show symptoms of contaminated fuel, but our fuel tests show nothing unusual." Weber's voice was tight with frustration. "Then test again. Use different methods. This cannot be coincidence. 23 tanks in 2 weeks. We've tested repeatedly, Herr Oberstleutnant. The fuel meets all field specifications. Ignition is normal. Viscosity is acceptable. We cannot find contamination. Then why are the engines failing?" Richter had no answer. Neither did any maintenance officer across the German front lines. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that American innovation had created a problem their military doctrine had no framework to address. German military training emphasized discipline, protocol, and adherence to established procedure. Their fuel testing procedures were standardized, rigorous, and designed to catch obvious contamination. What they'd never anticipated was contamination designed specifically to pass those tests while causing progressive damage over hours of operation. The German military mind, trained to think in terms of direct confrontation and measurable threats, couldn't conceive of a weapon that worked through patience and chemistry rather than immediate destruction. At Allied intelligence headquarters, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Captain Sarah Mitchell from Boston, a former chemistry teacher who joined the Women's Army Corps and been assigned to technical intelligence analysis, was the first to recognize that something systematic was happening. She'd compiled German radio intercepts, reconnaissance reports, and prisoner interrogations into a comprehensive analysis. The data showed 18 confirmed Panzer tank abandonments, with additional reports of mechanical problems affecting dozens more German armored vehicles. The failures clustered around specific geographic areas and time periods. "This isn't random mechanical failure," she briefed Colonel Patterson, the intelligence director. "The pattern is too consistent. Same symptoms, same time frame, same fuel system failures. The Germans are experiencing coordinated mechanical sabotage, but they can't identify the source." "Partisan activity?" Patterson suggested. "Partisans don't have the chemistry knowledge or access to create fuel contamination this sophisticated. This requires someone who understands engine mechanics and fuel chemistry at an advanced level." "So what's your theory?" Mitchell chose her words carefully. "Someone on our side has figured out how to contaminate German fuel supplies in a way that passes their field tests, but destroys engines under operational stress. I don't know who or how, but the results are undeniable." Patterson studied her analysis. "If we had a weapon this effective, I'd know about it. This isn't any authorized program." "Then it's unauthorized. Someone's improvising." The conversation reached Dutch Morrison through the same intelligence corporal who'd been feeding him intercepts. Eddie Kowalski pulled him aside during evening formation. "Intelligence is asking questions about German fuel problems. They know someone's doing something. They just don't know who." Dutch felt ice in his stomach. What are they asking specifically? "They're looking for anyone with advanced chemistry or fuel systems knowledge. They're reviewing personnel files for mechanics, chemists, engineers. They're trying to find whoever's responsible." "What are you going to tell them?" Eddie looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going to tell them I don't know anything. But Dutch, you need to be careful. If they figure out it's you and this is unauthorized, you're looking at serious trouble." "Eddie, 18 tanks, 18 Panzer tanks destroyed without costing us a single American life. How much trouble is that worth? Depends on whether command sees it as innovation or insubordination." The question haunted Dutch as reports continued arriving. The German mechanical crisis was spreading beyond the initial contamination. Wehrmacht logistics had done exactly what Dutch had predicted. They'd redistributed captured fuel supplies across multiple units, spreading the contamination through their entire fuel network. Tanks that had been running fine suddenly experienced failures. Commanders blamed maintenance crews. Maintenance crews blamed supply units. Supply units blamed bombed refineries. Nobody suspected that a Detroit mechanic had introduced a chemical time bomb into their logistics system. By November 25th, the effect on German operations was measurable. The planned German offensive in the Hürtgen forest was delayed due to insufficient operational armor. Panzer divisions that should have been combat-ready were instead deadlined for maintenance. American forces advancing into Germany encountered less armor resistance than intelligence had predicted, and still, the Germans couldn't identify the cause. At a German tactical conference on November 27th, Wehrmacht officers debated theories that ranged from accurate to absurd. Some blamed Allied bombing of refineries, arguing that German fuel quality had deteriorated. Others suggested that cold weather was causing fuel to gel prematurely. One desperate officer suggested sabotage by forced laborers in German fuel facilities. Oberstleutnant Weber, watching his Panzer division become progressively immobile, made the proposal that sealed the effectiveness of Dutch's strategy. All fuel from forward-captured depots should be considered suspect. Use only fuel from established German supply chains. The order was transmitted across German units. Avoid captured fuel. Use only verified German supplies. It was a sensible decision based on the principle of supply chain security. But it had unintended consequences that Dutch had never predicted. German logistics, already strained by Allied bombing and partisan activity, couldn't replace the captured fuel they were now refusing to use. Fuel shortages rippled through frontline units. Tanks that could be repaired couldn't be refueled. Operations were curtailed, not because of combat losses, but because of logistics paralysis created by fear of contamination. A single mechanic's improvised fuel mixture had created strategic paralysis through a cascading effect of mechanical failure, diagnostic confusion, and logistics paranoia. On December 1st, Dutch received an unexpected visitor. Captain Sarah Mitchell from Intelligence appeared at the Antwerp depot, asking to speak with him privately. They met in a quiet corner of the maintenance bay, surrounded by the familiar smell of grease and diesel. Staff Sergeant Morrison, I'm investigating the German fuel contamination incidents. Your name came up during personnel review. Advanced mechanical knowledge, 14 years of civilian experience, currently assigned to fuel systems. Dutch's heart hammered. Ma'am, I service vehicles as assigned. I'm not here to accuse you of anything, Sergeant. I'm here because I need to understand something. The contamination affecting German fuel is sophisticated. It passes field tests but destroys engines progressively. That requires knowledge of both fuel chemistry and engine mechanics. It requires understanding how German field testing works. It requires access to German fuel samples. She paused, watching his face carefully. If someone created this, and I believe someone did, they've probably saved hundreds of American lives. But they've also acted without authorization, which creates complications. So I'm asking you directly, do you know anything about this? Dutch faced the moment he'd been dreading and hoping for simultaneously. He could deny everything, maintain operational security, and hope the trail never led back to him. Or he could trust that innovation mattered more than protocol, that results mattered more than procedures. He made his choice, with the same practical instinct that had guided him in that maintenance bay 3 weeks ago. Ma'am, I noticed patterns in German after-action reports suggesting fuel system vulnerabilities. I hypothesized that fuel contamination could be weaponized if properly formulated. I tested various mixtures until I found one that would pass German field testing but cause progressive engine damage. I introduced approximately 60 gallons of contaminated fuel into captured German supplies on November 8th. Mitchell's expression didn't change. You did this without authorization? Yes, ma'am. I believe the tactical advantage justified the risk. Why didn't you go through proper channels? Because proper channels would have required months of testing, committee reviews, and approval processes. American tankers were dying every day. I had the knowledge, the opportunity, and the materials. I acted. That's either the most brilliant improvisation or the most reckless insubordination I've ever encountered. Ma'am, with respect, it's both. That's what makes it American. Captain Mitchell studied him for a long moment, then made a decision that would change the course of both Dutch's life and the war. Sergeant Morrison, you're going to write down every detail of your fuel mixture, your methodology, and your deployment strategy. Then you're going to help me present this to command as an intelligence breakthrough rather than an unauthorized operation. Because 18 destroyed Panzer tanks and the strategic paralysis you've created is too valuable to waste on a court-martial. Dutch Morrison had crossed into enemy logistics as a lone mechanic with jerry cans and chemistry knowledge. He was about to emerge as an innovator who changed how America fought wars. The Germans still didn't understand what had destroyed their Panzer divisions. But American command was about to learn that sometimes the most effective weapons came not from laboratories and factories, but from mechanics willing to trust their instincts and mix fuel in the dark. The briefing room at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, France, was designed to intimidate. High ceilings, oak paneling, and a massive table where generals planned the liberation of Europe. On December 8, 1944, Staff Sergeant Harold Morrison stood at attention before that table, facing an audience that included 2 generals, 4 colonels, and a dozen staff officers, while Captain Sarah Mitchell presented what she called the Morrison Fuel Contamination Protocol. Dutch had expected arrest. Instead, he received the most intense technical debriefing of his life. General Marcus Bradley, Deputy Commander of Operations, studied the chemical analysis that Mitchell had prepared from Dutch's notebooks. Captain Mitchell, you're telling me that one mechanic, acting alone, created a weapon that disabled 18 confirmed enemy tanks, plus an unknown number of additional vehicles, and created such systemic paranoia in German logistics that they're now refusing to use captured fuel supplies? Yes, sir. Sergeant Morrison identified a vulnerability in German fuel testing protocols, developed a contamination mixture that exploited that vulnerability, and deployed it through a captured German supply depot. The results exceeded any reasonable projection. And he did this without authorization, without oversight, and without informing his chain of command? Yes, sir. The room was silent. Dutch waited for the hammer to fall. Instead, General Bradley smiled, a thin, calculating smile that suggested he was recognizing something valuable. Gentlemen, what we're looking at is exactly the kind of asymmetric innovation that wins wars. The Germans are doctrinally superior in armor tactics. They've proven that repeatedly. But they're doctrinally inflexible in logistics. They assumed their fuel testing protocols were sufficient because those protocols had always been sufficient. Sergeant Morrison identified that assumption as a vulnerability and exploited it using materials and knowledge available to him. That's not insubordination, that's operational initiative of the highest caliber. Colonel Patterson from Intelligence added supporting context. Sir, the strategic impact extends beyond the immediate tank losses. German logistics are now operating under the assumption that any captured fuel might be compromised. They're refusing to use supplies that could be perfectly safe, creating self-imposed fuel shortages. Morrison's 60-gallon contamination has created a psychological effect far beyond its physical impact. How long until the Germans figure out the specific contamination method? Bradley asked. Captain Mitchell fielded that question. Our assessment is that they won't, at least not in time to matter. The contamination is subtle enough that standard field testing can't detect it. Detailed laboratory analysis could identify the mixture, but that requires facilities and time that frontline German units don't have. By the time Wehrmacht technical services diagnose the method, we can have shifted to different contamination protocols. Different protocols. Sir, Sergeant Morrison's methodology isn't limited to fuel. The same principles could apply to lubricants, hydraulic fluid, coolants, any fluid system that enemy equipment depends on. With proper resources and authorization, we could develop a comprehensive program of supply chain sabotage. General Bradley made his decision with the practical directness of a commander who understood that wars were won by flexibility rather than adherence to peacetime protocols. Sergeant Morrison, you're being transferred to a special technical unit reporting directly to Allied intelligence. Your mission is to develop and implement supply chain contamination protocols targeting German logistics. Captain Mitchell, you'll provide scientific oversight and operational coordination. Colonel Patterson, you'll handle security and deployment. I want this operational within 2 weeks. And Sergeant Morrison, next time you have a brilliant idea, you'll go through proper channels. But I want you to keep having brilliant ideas. Is that clear? Yes, sir, Dutch managed, still processing the fact that he wasn't being court-martialed. Over the following months, the Morrison Protocol, as it became officially designated, expanded beyond fuel contamination. Dutch trained a team of mechanics and chemists in contamination techniques. They developed protocols for lubricant contamination that caused bearings to seize, coolant additives that corroded engine blocks, and hydraulic fluid mixtures that destroyed brake systems. Intelligence operatives introduced these contaminants into German supply chains through captured depots, partisan networks, and false flag supply operations. The Germans never fully diagnosed the system. Individual contamination incidents were identified, but the German High Command never recognized that they were facing a coordinated campaign rather than random sabotage. Their response, increasing security around supply facilities and refusing to use captured materials, was exactly what Allied planners wanted. It forced German logistics to operate under impossible constraints, burning resources on paranoid security measures while their actual supplies remained inadequate. By March 1945, intelligence estimates suggested that Morrison Protocol operations had disabled or destroyed more than 200 German vehicles, tanks, trucks, artillery tractors, and command cars. The fuel contamination that Dutch had pioneered had been refined and deployed across multiple theaters. British forces used Morrison's methods in Italy. French partisans used them behind German lines. Even Soviet forces received briefings on the protocols, though they claimed to have developed similar methods independently. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Dutch Morrison was a technical sergeant assigned to the Army's Chemical Warfare Service. He'd been recommended for the Legion of Merit, though the citation was deliberately vague, for exceptional technical innovation in support of tactical operations. The details remained classified. Most Americans who celebrated victory in Times Square or on Market Street in San Francisco never knew that a Detroit mechanic had helped destroy German armor using nothing more than jerry cans, chemical knowledge, and the willingness to trust his instincts. After demobilization, Dutch returned to Dearborn, Michigan in September 1945. His brother Tommy had survived the war, married Sarah, and was using GI Bill benefits to study engineering at the University of Michigan. Dutch opened a garage on Michigan Avenue, Morrison's automotive service, using his mustering out pay and a small business loan. The garage became modestly successful. Dutch fixed Fords, Chevrolets, and Chryslers for customers who never knew that the quiet mechanic with grease under his fingernails had changed the course of a war. He never talked about his service beyond vague references to maintenance work in Europe. When customers asked if he'd seen combat, he deflected with self-deprecating humor. "I mostly fixed trucks and kept equipment running." The truth remained classified until 1983, when the Army declassified portions of the Chemical Warfare Service records related to non-lethal logistics sabotage programs. A military historian researching unconventional warfare tactics discovered the Morrison Protocol documents and tracked down Dutch, who was 71 years old and still working part-time in his garage. The historian, Dr. Jennifer Shaw from the Army War College, interviewed Dutch over 3 days, recording his first-hand account of developing and deploying fuel contamination tactics. Her resulting paper, Supply Chain Sabotage as Force Multiplier, the Morrison Fuel Contamination Protocol, 1944-1945, was published in the Journal of Military History and brought belated recognition to Dutch's innovation. The paper detailed statistics that Dutch had never known during the war. The original 60-gallon contamination he'd introduced in November 1944 had destroyed 18 Panzer tanks directly, but the cascading effects had been far greater. German logistics paranoia had caused them to abandon or destroy at least 150 additional gallons of captured fuel that was perfectly safe, creating artificial shortages that delayed operations. The contamination protocols developed from Dutch's original innovation had been deployed in 47 separate operations across the European theatre, with confirmed destruction of 203 German vehicles and probable destruction of hundreds more. Dr. Shaw's analysis concluded Sergeant Morrison's innovation represented a fundamental shift in warfare methodology. Traditional military doctrine focused on destroying enemy equipment through firepower. Morrison demonstrated that equipment could be equally neutralized through contamination and psychological operations. His methods were particularly effective because they exploited German doctrinal rigidity, their belief that standardized procedures provided security. By identifying gaps between procedure and reality, Morrison created a weapon that was simultaneously simple in execution and devastating in effect. The Morrison Protocol validates the principle that asymmetric innovation, applied by individuals with operational knowledge and willingness to take initiative, can achieve strategic effects disproportionate to resources invested. Dutch Morrison died in 1997 at age 85. His funeral in Dearborn was attended by family, friends, customers from his garage, and 3 Army historians. He was buried with full military honors. The American Legion Post in Dearborn named their annual scholarship the Harold Dutch Morrison Innovation Award, given to students pursuing engineering or technical fields. The lesson of Dutch Morrison's story isn't found in the chemistry of fuel contamination. Those specific formulas became obsolete as engine technology evolved. The lesson is found in the principle that innovation doesn't require laboratories, advanced degrees, or formal authorization. It requires knowledge, opportunity, and the willingness to act when others hesitate. Dutch Morrison proved that one person with practical expertise, operating from a cold maintenance bay at 2:47 a.m., could change the trajectory of history. He proved that American pragmatism, the willingness to improvise, to trust instincts, to break rules when rules prevented solutions, could overcome doctrinally superior enemies. He proved that wars are won not just by those who follow established procedures, but by those who recognize when procedures need to be rewritten. In November 1944, 18 Panzer tanks died from contaminated fuel, but the real victory wasn't measured in destroyed equipment. It was measured in American tankers who came home alive because German armor wasn't there to destroy them. It was measured in battles won because enemy logistics collapsed. It was measured in the principle that individual initiative, combined with technical knowledge and moral courage, could achieve what committee planning never would. The Germans never understood what killed their panzer divisions. They blamed bombed refineries, cold weather, and inexperienced mechanics. They never suspected that their defeat began with one Detroit mechanic mixing fuel in the dark, trusting that American innovation could overcome German superiority. That's the legacy of Harold Dutch Morrison, Not the fuel mixture itself, but the proof that ordinary Americans, armed with knowledge and determination, can accomplish extraordinary things when they trust themselves enough to try. The Panzers that died in Belgium in 1944 were destroyed by chemistry, but they were defeated by something far more powerful. The American spirit of practical innovation that refuses to accept the impossible and never stops looking for solutions. That spirit built the arsenal of democracy in Detroit's factories. It won battles on European soil, and it continues today in every mechanic, engineer, and innovator who looks at a problem and says, "There has to be a better way, and I'm going to find it." If this story of innovation, courage, and American ingenuity inspired you, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another untold story from Wontwow. Leave a comment telling us what other unsung heroes of the war you'd like to hear about. These stories deserve to be remembered and shared. Let's keep the legacy of heroes like Dutch Morrison alive. Thanks for watching, and remember, ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to accept impossible.